So, good morning. I am Chris Wilson, one of the web standards tech leads in Chrome. I'm here to talk about, surprise, surprise, web standards. If you don't know me, I've been working on web standards for about 30 years, a little over actually. Suffice to say, this is not my first BlinkOn. But for this talk, I was inspired by a TikTok vid. Yes, I have teenagers. They keep me informed. I'm a little bit more hip than hip replacement. But if you don't know the very demure, very mindful, cutesy even meme, I would encourage you to discover it on your own. I'm not going to actually run it here, but I was drawn in this meme because it was originally taught, like the original video that sparked this whole thread. It was about the need to be mindful and respectful, which kind of resonated really well. So I looked up Demure, and to be clear, Demure is usually defined as reserved, modest, and shy, which describes no one that I've ever met working on standards, I think. On the whole, we're a pretty assertive, if not aggressive bunch. And this is kind of for good reason. Like, we all believe in the future of the web, right? We want to make the web better. We're all very, very smart. We're all very passionate. And of course, this can lead people to be a little less than demure. But to be clear, like, demure itself is not really a good attribute anyways here. Like, you should be direct. You should be respectful. You should be positive, but maybe not shy and reserved. But the very demure, very mindful meme was really about being respectful, how you present yourself to others. And that part did really resonate. And I wanted to be clear, in the Chromium project, we really do believe that standards work should be psychologically safe. Like, we should include people, we should be productive, but we should be welcoming, fundamentally. We should be respectful. I know there's a lot of diverse perspectives. I know at the same time, we really have to have professional behavior. Fundamentally, we should be constructive in our criticism and conversations, even when we disagree. And a couple of years ago, Chris Harrelson and I started this effort to support this. We refer to this usually as the standards of behavior. If you haven't read this, please do go read it. I want to be clear, this doesn't replace codes of conduct in standards venues or anywhere else. It really supports them, builds on them, fundamentally kind of sets the expectation that, hey, these are a real thing. We want the spirit of codes of conduct to be followed, not just the letter of, did I harass you or not? It should actually be, hey, be respectful, be productive. We think participants should follow some pretty basic rules, be respectful, recognize the validity of others' points of view, even if you disagree with it. That's a big one. Don't assume things, ask for confirmation, and take actions that are constructive and lead toward consensus. Also a super important one. Now, this absolutely does not mean be demure. It doesn't mean don't be direct. You should be direct, you should be transparent. But declaring your opinion doesn't mean you need to call someone else's opinion stupid, for example. And I don't want to be too segmented in how I present this, but I do want to call out some differences in how this guidance affects those of you that I might have some direct say over, Googlers, versus the rest of everyone here. For Chrome team members, this really means two things. One, of course, we expect you to be open, honest, inclusive, respectful. We expect you to have exemplary behavior. If you don't expect, we'll probably call you on it. But secondly, and probably even more important, this means we do actually expect you to have a non-abusive environment and standards to work on. Like, we expect you to feel safe when you're working in standards. And standards work can be super frustrating. I know from super long experience, when you're working with people who don't have the same priorities, the same background, the same design constraints, the same ship cycles that you do, particularly if you are working for the 800-pound gorilla in the room, others can tend to be disrespectful to you just because, they think it's okay, like that, because of that power imbalance. And to be clear, while I recognize and respect that there is a role of privilege in prioritizing safety, that it's still critical to understand. Respect is important. Like, we should be respectful all the time. People should be respectful to you. So in short, Chromies, we're here to help. If you have issues here, please do reach out. Personal abuse is not okay. You don't have to just put up with it. For the rest of you, for those of you who don't work for Google, I mean, it's not okay for you to be in an abusive situation either. I want to be super clear. But I expect you to ask us to improve if any of our team members aren't living up to those expectations. But this doesn't mean you have to tattle on people. Like, please do go talk to them first. Just if you need help, we are there for you. We will also do likewise the other way around. And I don't want to give the idea that we're out there to tone police every conversation. This has actually been going really well the last year or two, I think. We've seen a bunch of improvement in some of these conversations, which I'm super happy about. But if we all work together to recognize and call out anti-productive behavior, and anti-inclusive behavior even, I think we can build a much better community. Now, whether you work for Google or not, I would ask and encourage you to participate in making those conversations better. Both, I mean, help improve this guidance if you want, but also just working to make those conversations more inclusive overall. If you have questions and concerns, you can email Web Standards Ombuds at Google. This currently goes just to Jeffrey Askin and myself. And more than anything here, please help us continue to raise the bar for better, more welcoming and collaborative discussions. Now, to go back to my demure and mindful framing, improving our collective productivity kind of helps focus our awareness in the moment to me. But the main point I wanted to make about developing the web platform is that we need to be more mindful than usual about the impacts of our work, because we have to be really aware of the breadth of the entire web ecosystem when we build functionality. Because the web is this big, huge shared platform, right? It works across a whole lot of devices, many different vendors, operating systems, all kinds of stuff. This leads to a bigger, more accessible market for everyone. But this happens because of the interoperability of the web, because it works everywhere. You don't need to get all your tools, your browsers, your engines, your servers, whatever, from one vendor. And this makes a huge difference in what platform we're building. But it's important to note that this multi-stakeholder platform means developing the web platform is really different, even from developing a normal platform, like a normal operating system or something. You don't get to just design a feature, build it, ship it. You have to build a community. You have to get consensus on a particular design. You have to build a bunch of different prototypes, see how it works in all different kinds of situations. And then maybe you get to lock in a standard and ship it. But the cool thing, and this is an important one, the cool thing is this means you get to impact an ecosystem that's much, much bigger than your employer even if you work for Google or Microsoft. And fundamentally, this probably sums up why I still work on the web platform 30 years later and 2 major employers later. I wanted to call out Chrome is actually the 4th browser that I've worked on. 2 of those browsers, previous browsers, not counting Chrome, at some point or other, held the vast majority of the market share. Neither one of them functionally exists anymore. Like, the web platform outlives engines, it outlives browsers, even Chromium, probably. I mean, I can't say that for sure, but do be prepared that it might. Like, that's kind of the point of the web platform. So the mindful goal here, the really important goal, is we want to responsibly move the web platform forward. We want to add things to this broad open platform, and we have a responsibility not to fragment the web as we do it, not to destroy its ubiquity. And I want to be clear that we should keep moving it forward. Like, it's not a static, we're not done with the web. Like, this was definitely a misstep in one of my past employers. They kind of thought it was done. But it's important that the web continues to evolve, but our ultimate goal is not just making one engine better. It's moving the whole platform. So all users, all developers, all web properties can benefit. Now, it might be obvious at this point, but in a hallway chat I had yesterday with Brian Cardell, we were talking about why standards take so long. And it's really because we each end up having limited resources on any particular feature, but every feature needs this broad perspective. It needs attention from a huge number of people, a huge number of stakeholders. And getting those, like getting that attention can be the hardest part of this. Brian captured this really well, and I was taking notes as we were just having a side chat. He captured this by saying, you know, you need to get across to people that this is important to me right now, but I need to make it important to a whole bunch of other people. And that's really hard to do a lot of times. If you want an earful, ask me about WebMIDI. I won't go into it more now, although it does come up again. Brian also compared developing standards to running a gauntlet, which is probably pretty appropriate too. He mentioned this video, so I had to put it in. I love the ring of fire at the end. I call it a recommendation. But there's a point, like there's a point to running that gauntlet, why we try to get there. A specification really just defines a feature. It defines a solution to a problem. Now, the standard spec is that definition, but it also adds in consensus from a bunch of other people, from a broad set of stakeholders, that not only is this a solution that could work, this is how it does work. And the point of having that standard is to create that interoperability, to make it so it does just work that way, hopefully across all the web, but at least across more than just one engine. So the fundamental statement, by the way, that a standard should be about what does work is probably, in a nutshell, what created the WhatWG. Now, Dominic Denicola has also framed this before in an interesting way, which is that specifications are like a program, and they're written in this weird dialect of English, but it has to compile for different environments with different compilers, different browser engineers. And this is a great way of thinking about it. Like, this is basically, those standards have to have multiple compile targets. They have different web engines, but they're like code that has to be agnostic to what compile target they're shooting for. Specs are the high-level language, and each browser's team of compilers take it as their job to map that onto their individual architecture, data structures, so on. This also, you can start looking at how this feeds into all of the other things about engineering on spec work. And these too take a huge amount of time, as we all know. And just like with engineering, by the way, most of these have grown up over time. When I first started building browsers even, we did not do all of these kind of code health things. We had a compiler and went for it. And maybe that wasn't the best idea. But these have also grown up around specifications as well. So we analyze specs for various attributes, and those are important. Just like with regular coding, there are compiler guidelines, there are code quality guidelines, and in addition to just becoming familiar with other specifications, there's a lot of platform design docs. One of the best ones or most complete ones is the W3C tags design principles doc. And although this document is long, it captures most of the design guidelines that you need to build web APIs. This is like the set of a couple of books that lived on my bookshelf behind me when I was an engineer. But I wanted to frame the process by which we should be mindfully developing standards, standards platform features. You start really by writing down use cases and scenarios. Please don't start with IDL. Like, start with a use case, a scenario, what problem you're trying to solve. Write an explainer, get people interested in it. You want to convene a broader set of stakeholders than just you. This is like why we have this bar with taking incubations into the YCG, that you need to have someone who doesn't work for the same employer say, hey, this is an interesting idea. We should totally incubate this for a while. Just one. Doesn't have to be another browser engine or anything. Just has to be somebody else who says, oh, that's an interesting idea. Sure, let's go work on it for a while. But then you can incubate that solution, you can build prototypes. And then of course, there's the huge, long, big part of developing a standard, which is iterating. It's building consensus in the community on a single solution, on the needs, the solution, the details of that. And then, we will, by the way, I want to say this again because I say this every time I give a similar talk. In Chromium, we will absolutely ship features that don't have all of that consensus, that don't have the support from other browser engines, that this feature should work, it should work exactly this way, it should be part of the web. This consensus is not a requirement to add code to Chromium. It is a metric, but you can't really consider that feature a web standards platform feature until you've gotten that kind of consensus, until it's been broadly accepted. The end of a features journey is converging on the interoperability, not just getting your spec done and shipping code in Chromium. Now, I would mention that as stewards of the web platform, because that's what we are, when we don't have other vendors on board, when we can't get a final recommendation or similar kind of standards level thing, and we do ship a feature because we do, this isn't failure. Like, I don't want anyone to feel like this is a failure. Sometimes other vendors have different priorities. They may be lagging in an area, they may just not be agreeing, whatever, but we do have a responsibility to continue to drive the standards work even after we've shipped. And this may mean we have to come back to features and redo parts, hopefully not, but we need to pay attention to the adoption across the ecosystem. We have to continue to push for that cross-vendor stabilization. Eventually, maybe other vendors will come around, other engines will come around, other implementers will come around. I will go back and say Firefox finally shipped WebMIDI like 10 years after we shipped it in Chromium and I wrote the spec. So that's great. But it also means Chrome is now spending time. One of our engineers is working on finalizing the spec, getting it to recommendation status. So I'm really looking forward to checking off that WebMIDI interoperable standard off my career to-do list. So we do have a responsibility, though, to represent these features as Chromium features, not as web standards features in that interim, though. I have this document every time I give a similar talk. I think, wow, I really need to figure out how to publish this publicly. I have a long set of guidance that I wrote years ago to the DevRel team about this is how you should use what term. And how we use terms like this actually does matter a lot. You can call pretty much anything a proposal or even a specification. Just means stuff written down. But calling something a standard or even standards track is important. It means something, and it means something to other people. So we have to be cautious about making sure those things really are considered broad standards. Now, luckily, at W3C, this is pretty straightforward. We have two different kinds of groups: community groups, working groups. Community groups can only incubate features. They can never build anything that is considered a standard. They can build an idea, an incubation, and then hand it off to a working group, and the working group can standardize it. But they can't actually produce a definitive standard. The good thing, though, is they also don't need to be consensus-based. Like, you can have competing ones, you can start one of these super easily, you can just go incubate stuff. Working groups, on the other hand, they have to be put together, frankly, by some measure of consensus. Like, the whole W3C membership gets to vote on whether we create a working group or not. They're harder to start for that reason, of course. But they do produce official recommendations, things that have the consensus of the entire membership. They do sometimes incubate features inside themselves, but they usually have a clear process to do that, like CSS Working Group does this, certainly. Now, we use those two types of groups to take features from inception to hopefully interoperability. We incubate first in the community groups. We try to build a lot of momentum and explore the solutions. And then once we've baked a design and gotten broad buy-in, it's time to move that into a working group or into the WhatWG. That way we can ensure there's broad commitment to it, broad consensus. We can collect much better intellectual property rights, a topic I won't go into because I know it's super fascinating to everyone, but it is important. But we can then finish the detail and hopefully gain interoperable implementations. Now, I did say, I did want to make one call out here, which is that for WhatWG features or features that will land in DOM or HTML, we actually created a new stages policy that helps us to kind of feed incubations in earlier, get WhatWG editors looking at them, start building some kind of broad visibility, at least, to different features. So if you haven't seen that, there's a link in this deck. Because fundamentally, what makes a spec into a standard? Hopefully you all know the answer by now. It's interoperability. Like multiple implementations, which requires a community consensus, is really what makes a standard, not just us declaring, hey, this is a standard. That doesn't really work in the end. So to wrap up this point, at least, standards are hard. Don't feel like a failure if your spec doesn't immediately become a broadly accepted interoperable standard. That's not failure. Standards move slowly. Be prepared for that. They take a ton of time. They're not under your control most of that time. I certainly had to spend a lot of time telling myself WebMIDI was not a failure as a standard, because even during the whole decade that we only had one implementation, I knew that was a valuable feature, tons of acceptance from a community, just not other implementations, not an interoperable standard yet, but we are now there, so I feel really good about that. Now to wrap up, I'm going to go back to my framing, my very demure, very mindful framing. I'm supposed to talk about how standards is cutesy, and I seem to have backed myself into a corner with this framing. So I'm just going to go with standards. Puppy wants you to work on standards. And thank you very much. I listed a bunch of things that I really wanted to talk about, but then each one of them was like another 10 minutes into this talk. But I did at least give you some conversation starters that I'm happy to talk about anytime. And I think we do have several minutes for questions or comments. Thanks. Just bouncing up and down.
Or this just for today.
Yes.
So awesome talk. Thank you for telling us about like the stewardship of the web platform for with this time frame. Can you talk a little bit about living standards? Our working group is intending to transition to a living standard right after candidate recommendation, because it doesn't make sense to have like these yearly milestones.
So when you say your working group wants to move this, you mean a W3C working group. Living standard is the updatable rec kind of CRS version. Okay. The hard part, the difficult part, and I'll see how quickly I can get through this. These two worlds of how you produce a web standard, WhatWG and W3C, have some different values and different motivations. WhatWG is really awesome because there is one source of truth. You want to know how this feature works in the standard, you go to the current copy of the standard, you look it up, that's it. Nothing should be in that standard, at least not for very long, that isn't implemented across multiple engines. I mean, that's kind of the fundamental, this is how the feature works in the real world. W3C standards have a very strong value placed on horizontal review, specifically like accessibility, internationalization, security and privacy are getting there, a few others. And unfortunately, this means they have to review them. And so they have this process that used to be an exceedingly long process where you would ship a recommendation, and in order to get there, you had to propose it. It lasted in proposed recommendation for a while, then it became candidate recommendation. And during the candidate recommendation, to get there at each one of these steps, you would get reviews from all these horizontal things, and that would let you proceed to the next step. There was definitely some recognition that, hey, we should be able to update recommendations, because originally you couldn't even update a recommendation. You wanted a new version of CSS, you had to create a new thing that was CSS2, not CSS1 version 2, really. I mean, it seems subtle, but like the naming was important. I guess what I'm trying to get at fundamentally is in the W3C system, there is a process version that uses updatable recommendations and a process to get there, so that you can continually update your spec. The hard part is it will never quite be as easy, as smooth for editors as the WhatWG version, because at some point they still have to do this. Hey, I need to have this reviewed for these horizontals. Like, I need to go get the accessibility crew to go look at the spec again and make sure that the updates haven't caused issues. So you can't just get one editor version on a GitHub where you can keep checking in changes that meet a certain bar without ever doing anything else. But you can, like, have your editor every once in a while fire a mail over and say, please look at these, and it will update them automatically, but you have to keep your changes marked. This is all laid out in the process. Happy to go into more detail. It's not quite as easy, but it's pretty close. And it does leave you with one current source of truth. You point to one spec. The only thing is some parts of your spec are going to have sections that say basically, this is the way it should be working, but the currently accepted version says this, but they are still both there. And I hope that gave you more detail than you were looking for. But if not, we can talk afterwards.
Thanks, Chris. Great talk, as always. You said, you kind of implied that it was easy to determine what makes standards, interoperability, which is multiple independent implementations. Where are we on the topic of what an independent implementation is? You know, especially for this audience, you know, do we have example, like, does it have to be more than 50% of the code? Are there cases where Edge and Chrome, for example, have independent implementations, maybe an EME, for example, you know, and are there places where, like, hey, if two implementations happen to share the Skia library underneath, does that still count as independent?
So I think later this afternoon, my friend Tantek Chelik from Mozilla is going to be around, and he would be a great person to nail with this question, because the AV priority on interoperable implementations is on his plate. I don't think it's crisply defined, but I think that the important thing to think of here is the whole point of having implementation experience be a key factor for standards is to make sure that you can interoperably implement it across different systems. And really, like, to use WebMIDI as an example, we had to have a different implementation on Macs than we do on Android. Like, because the underlying APIs we call totally different. They don't work quite the same way at all. So we really did have kind of multiple routes, at least. By contrast, the implementation on Mac OS of WebMIDI in WebKit is probably nearly identical to what we do in Chromium on WebKit, or on Mac OS, I mean. I think in general, there are times and places where absolutely like Edge and Chrome could have separate implementations of a feature. In Immersive, for example, we have a WebXR implementation. Meta has another WebXR implementation. Doesn't share the same code in all places. And they absolutely have places where they have what I would consider an independent implementation. I don't think that code that is deeply codified anywhere yet. I would say use best judgment and don't try to cheat the whole goal, right? Like, this is my meta guidance, is don't try to cheat the goal. We're trying to make it so if somebody else on a totally different system had to implement this, everything they need is there in the spec, right? If I go create a whole different operating system and I say, okay, time to build a web browser, and I start from a blank page, there should be enough specs for me to figure out how to do that. I know, sounds crazy, probably is, but yeah.
Thanks. I'm from NVIDIA. My name is Sunshin, and I'm working on cloud gaming. We are having some use case for the keyboard lock, and that is incubation spec. And I actually had a discussion with Gary and how to make it more wider standard as a working group standard. And we talk about that, exactly the same topic, how we can make it working group standard. And like you said, we have another implementation other than Chrome. So I'm just confused. If there are any browser which can support that feature, would it be okay, or should we have more other browsers implementation? Can you explain a little bit more detail about that step?
I mean, I think our goal is to try to get to the point where it is easier to get more attention, to get people to look at things across different, not even different engines necessarily, but like different implementation goals. One of the things that we have done, I think, quite successfully in what WG over the last couple of years has been the system of having regular triage meetings for features and trying to ensure that we get a broad set of stakeholders involved in those meetings. So we can raise things and say, who needs to look at this to make this objectionable, to make this objection go away, or to make sure that it's okay with different engines. I think we haven't done this well in W3C yet. And this is another of the main advisory board priorities, also definitely not on my plate, on Elika Edamad's plate, of how to manage those transitions better, how to do incubation transitions, because also we have a strong tendency in Chromium to just sort of leave things in incubation. Like, well, we shipped it. If anybody else wants to pick it up, it's cool with us. And we really do need to do more than that. We need to say, you know what? The spec is baked well enough. We think that this should be, get more adoption, get a broader set, go into an actual, CR at some point soon. We've also had features that have shipped in incubation, been implemented by other browsers, other engines, I should say, and then never moved. Like they just sit there as sort of waffly spec. That's not a good idea either. Like we should nail those things down.
Hey, Chris, great talk as usual. Thank you so much for the guidance. One of the things that I struggle with, I love your framing in terms of kind of like going over how it's not sufficient for you to have your work just affect one specific engine, and the web much broader than that. But one of the things that I struggle with is that it almost feels like that also having browser interoperability almost also doesn't feel like it's sufficient, in that it has to be, in that it has to go farther than that in also finding product market fit with both users and developers. I mean, in my space, you have things like, in the space that I operate in, you have things like basic auth as an example of something that's interoperable, but not useful for users or developers. There's probably parts of payments that aren't as useful to users and developers as they thought they would be. So I wonder, when we talk about web standards, it almost feels like it's enough for it to be interoperable. So I wonder if there's a term that represents like a well-adopted and a well-accepted web standard. The other example for users that is interoperable but maybe isn't maybe a good web standard is the notifications API that became more noisy than it necessarily needs to be. So I wonder, is there like a bigger term that we could use?
I think the biggest, I like this one particular term that needs a tweak to make it ideal for this, which is I like the term fit for purpose. And the important bit here is fit for broad purpose. Like one of the rabbit holes we get down in, and I've absolutely been in this exact rabbit hole as an engineer building standards features, is you want to solve one problem and you don't think about the broader problem space or what other people might want to use it for. And this, like, payments is a good example of a space where someone could show up to that table, that consensus building community, and they really only care about one very narrow set of users or developers, one narrow set of constraints. Sometimes that's okay, and that's the API you should be building. But I do think it's important for us to consider, as we build things, is this fit for a broader purpose? Like, I won't get into the one example I'm thinking of because it's a little involved, but it's really easy to get into a specific kind of blinders on mode of, I'm just going to solve this single problem, not look around. At the same time, you know, sometimes you do need to very much look at what problem, where the developers and the users are going to be. Like, another good example of this is app cache from HTML5. Like, it was a fine system. Unfortunately, it was developed for a world that was starting to not exist anymore. And what we really needed was service workers, or, you know, a different solution, at least a broader solution. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris.